Time for this week's discussion on books with Neville Gibson. The big story of the week is the stabbing in New York of Salman Rushdie. Now, Neville, you've been looking back over his career and you've had some personal encounters, I understand. Tell us about those.
Well, I did. I was at the Adelaide Writers' Festival in March 1984. It was at the start of a bit of OE, and this was the first type of event in Australia and New Zealand. They were big-name authors, some of them of the day. Others have become more famous since. But Rushdie was the main attraction. He'd just published Midnight's Children. It had won the Booker Prize, and it was the book that everyone was talking about. And Rushdie really, what he did was opened up the Anglo-Indian, if you can call it that, the writers in English in India basically turned it into an international sort of genre, and it led to a lot of other writers coming along behind him.
So let's stay with Midnight's Children. What impact did that book have?
Well, I think apart from winning the Booker once, it also won it twice more. It was the Booker for the 25th anniversary. In other words, it was the Booker of Bookers. And then again in the 40th anniversary, and the book is still in print. It goes through dozens of different covers, and there's a film being made of it. The film's I could describe it as reverential. It just sort of sticks to the plot. But really the pleasure of reading a Rushdie book is the way he uses English, and it's almost like the South Americans use what they call magic realism, but his is quite a different type of fantastical writing, if you know what I mean. It mixes a little bit of supernatural, but it's written in native English, whereas, of course, the South Americans are writing in Spanish.
So just going back to that trip to Australia, you say that trip was influential in his writing of the Satanic Verses.
That comes from reading Rushdie's, it's not an autobiography, but it's a memoir of what happened after this book was published, and he wrote that some years ago, and this goes back to 1989. But when you read the origins, was that he went in after Adelaide, he went with Bruce Chatwin and took him through the Outback, and in Alice Springs they found a book called Tracks by Robin Davidson. She trekked 1,600 kilometres across the Gibson Desert, some relation somewhere, with camels. And guess what? Rushdie took a real fancy to it. So Chatwin said, oh, well, when we're in Sydney, you can meet up. And they did. And they had a 3-year affair.
Oh,
so
really?
That's quite an interesting one. I've got to say the second encounter I had with Salman Rushdie, I can't quite remember where it happened, but I've got here his signature on the inside of this book. And that proves that I did get close to him at some stage, but I can't remember that actual encounter. So that's a story yet to be told.
In the memoir by Joseph Anton, published in 2012, what does it say about the impact of the fatwa that was put on him in 1989?
Well, Rushdie was very taken with the Outback, and you talk about dream time periods in the desert, and he sort of links that back to Moses and Muhammad and the periods in the desert, and there's a lot of Australian references there. There's some anecdotal stories, but it's really the book, the Satanic Verses, is really about migrants, people arriving in new countries, that kind of thing. So it's very much an Australian sort of flavour to it, a bit like what D.H. Lawrence did with his book Kangaroo. The Australian Outback has quite a big impact on writers, and of course we've had people like Patrick White. Voss was another inspiration. Voss was about a Prussian explorer and naturalist who went missing in the desert, has never been found.
You've also been reading his latest novel, Kashody. How does that stack up against his others, do you think?
I've got to say, when you look at those books that run to 600 pages, this is quite a short novel by Rushdie's standards. He says he's not going to write any long ones anymore. But this is really quite a fun read. It's set in America, where Rushdie lives, of course, and it's a sort of layer upon layer. It's actually a fiction. There's a fictional story in there, with a lot of interesting characters, and the writer of that fiction is also writes spy stories, and one of them is a reference to the Five Eyes, which of course is the intelligence network, and there's a bit of a slight there about Kiwis. Basically, they've never come up with any decent surveillance system, and Rushdie, or the author, makes a comment that those five members of the Five Eyes, none of them trust each other.
Obviously, Rushdie's in the news for having been stabbed recently, but where do you think his reputation stands now?
Well, certainly Midnight's Children hasn't really been matched in terms of readership. It's always in print, and his other books are not turgid, but they're very long. And he's written quite a number of books that I haven't read because they look a bit too daunting. But certainly the publicity given to him in the past week, it's all over the world. So it's and it's already caused a big re-interest in satanic verses, which had difficulties getting publishers, and paperback editions were canned, that kind of thing. But he's now back on the best-selling list there at Amazon, so I'm sure his bank balance is going to be well improved.
Pretty severe way to get there, though.
And we hope that his health comes around pretty quickly.
All right, well, thanks very much, Neville Gibson.
Thank you.